It's 4 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started with the American Eel Management Board. Welcome to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. American Eel Management Board, I'm calling this meeting to order. I'm Chris Kuhn, the administrative proxy for Pennsylvania and current chair of the American Eel Board. That's all we need is for Tony to pound something on the table to get everybody to take their seats. So appreciate that. So we're going ahead and get started. Our vice chair is Jesse Hornstein from New York. Our technical committee chair is Danielle Carty from South Carolina. Advisory panel chair, Mitch Feinenbaum from Pennsylvania. And law enforcement committee representative, Rob Beal from Maine. I'm joined here at the front table by Caitlin Starks and Dr. Kristen Anstead with the commission and Deborah Hahn from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So let's go ahead and get started with this meeting's agenda. The first order of business is approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed modifications to the agenda? Okay, seeing none around the room. I don't know if there's any commissioners online. No hands online. So seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. So the board didn't meet during the ASMSC summer meeting. So next we're considering approval of the proceedings from the May 2024 board meeting. Are there any edits to the proceedings from the May 2024 meeting of the American Eel Management Board? Okay, I don't see any around the room. Assuming there's no online, the proceedings from the May 2024 meeting are approved by consent. Okay, moving on to public comments. Are there any members of the public, either here or online, that would like to make comments pertaining to items that are not on today's agenda? Again, this is for items specifically not on today's agenda. We have one action item on today's agenda, and that is to consider the approval of the Fisheries Management Plan review and state compliance for 2023 fishing year. And depending on time, the public may be given the opportunity to comment on that consideration later in this meeting. Also, as a reminder to commissioners and others making public comments in the room to please move your microphone down and ensure that it is turned on when you're making comments so we can hear you. So are there any comments from the public today? James Fletcher online.
Thank you, sir. Not mentioned, the electromagnetic lines affecting the larval movement from the Sargasso Sea back up to the rivers and sounds of the whole East Coast has not been addressed. And someone should have the ability to simply put some larvae in a tank and watch what the effects of electromagnetics does to them. If those transmission lines are not shielded 100%, no leakage, we will not have an eel fishery on the East Coast in 10 years. Thank you for your time. I would mention that the nano and microplastics also affect the larval eels, but it'll take y'all 10 years to look at that and I'll be dead and gone. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you for the comment, Mr. Fletcher. Okay, moving on to item 4 on the agenda, which is to review and provide feedback on CITES actions and committee work. CITES being the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, Fauna and Flora. So as you may recall, the CITES Standing Committee formed a work group pertaining to eels, which will provide recommendations to the Standing Committee in early 2025. And any eel species that could potentially impact the United States eel fishery. So to get us started, we're going to hear a presentation from Deborah Hahn from AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, regarding CITES actions and committee work. Deborah, we're ready for your presentation.
All right, thanks, Chris. I appreciate some time on your agenda and the opportunity to have this conversation. I am the International Relations Director for AFWA, or the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. My role really exists because treaties and conventions like CITES that we're going to talk about here pose opportunities and challenges to the management and conservation of U.S. native species, and therefore they pose challenges and opportunities to the agencies that manage those species. I really tried to bring back information from a number of international forums to the states and provinces and territories and talk about whether there are actions we need to take, meetings we need to attend, positions we need to develop, so that those voices are heard in those international forums. For CITES in particular, AFWA has a CITES technical work group that was created by the state fish and wildlife agencies back in the early 90s. That group works in order to have the state agencies represented in CITES forums where there are just too many meetings and too many topics for individual states to participate effectively. So the states decided that having a member from one member from each of the state regional associations to formulate this work group was the best way to have their voices heard and be represented. Buddy Baker is the representative for the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Gordon Batchelor for the Northeast Association, Carolyn Caldwell for the Midwest, and then Stuart Liley for WAFWA, or the Western Association. So Tony asked me to come today and give you a brief overview of what CITES is and what conversations are going on within the CITES community right now around American eel. And those include potential CITES listings in one of two appendices, and then a resolution that's being developed, a genus level resolution on eels that's being developed through CITES. So I'll get into those, but first I'll talk a little bit about the treaty itself. So it came into force in 1975. There are currently 184 countries that are signatories to the convention. That includes 183 individual countries and then the European Union as a bloc. Really at its core, the intent of CITES is to ensure that international trade in plants and animals does not threaten the survival of the species in the wild. And I'd like to emphasize that it's international trade. It has no impact on domestic trade. So what exactly does CITES do? Well, it regulates the export, re-export, and import of live plants and animals, dead plants and animals, and their parts and derivatives for those species that are listed in one of three appendices. Each country has an implementing agency, and here in the US, that's the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and they get their authority and also the language on how to implement CITES is found within our Endangered Species Act. So again, CITES represents or regulates international trade, and that international trade requires permits and certificates. And the two things that you typically need to prove are, one, that the trade is not detrimental to the survival of the species that's being traded, and that it was legally acquired by the laws of the country in which it is being traded from. Then these permits and certificates are required to be presented when entering or leaving a country. So I keep mentioning these appendices, and I just want to mention exactly what they are. So we've got Appendix 1 here, where no commercial trade in a species is allowed. You can have limited non-commercial trade for things like scientific research or zoos. These species in this appendix might include the white rhino or sturgeon, for example. If you move to Appendix 2, that's where most of the species are found. You can see it's quite a large number of plants and animals that are listed in Appendix 2. Commercial and non-commercial trade are allowed, again, through that permit and certificate system. And then you come to Appendix 3, which is a little bit different, and we'll talk more about that, but commercial and non-commercial trade are also allowed, but with an Appendix 3, you only are required to have a legal acquisition finding. Species in the US that are listed in Appendix 2 might include bobcat, black bear, a suite of turtle species, American ginseng. Appendix 3, our hellbender is listed in Appendix 3, for example. one more thing I want to mention. So in order to get put in one of these appendices, CITES has developed a set of biological and trade criteria that it uses to determine whether a species should be listed. So at each regular meeting of the parties, this is called a conference of the parties, and one is happening next year in 2025, and that's why we're having this conversation. At each of these, parties will submit proposals to amend the appendices, which means to either put a species in an Appendix 1 or an Appendix 2, move them between it, or remove them. And this is the process for getting species in or out of Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. At those meetings, those conference of the parties, you will either, there will be discussion about the proposal, and they were either adopted by consensus or by a 2/3 vote. Now, Appendix 3 is slightly different. In order to list an species in Appendix 3, it is a unilateral decision of an individual country and does not require the approval of a conference of the parties or other signatories. So I'd like to just talk a little bit more about Appendix 2 and Appendix 3, because those are the two appendices that American eel is being considered for listing in. So I mentioned that Appendix 2 allows commercial and non-commercial trade. It does not ban trade. It only regulates, again, international trade. So any trade in American eel that will be leaving the United States. It is not necessarily a list of species that are threatened with extinction, but a list of species that may become so if trade is not regulated and monitored. This appendices also includes look-alike species, and these are species that are listed because they look like a species that meets the criteria for this appendices, even if they don't. So here in the US, river otter and bobcat are two examples of look-alike species that don't necessarily meet the biological and trade criteria of CITES, but are listed because they look like a species that does. So these listings are decided every 2 or 3 years at a conference of the parties, which again is, as I mentioned, coming up here in December. The requirements, if a species were listed, if American eel were listed in Appendix 2, it would require that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is the agency that implements CITES, to determine that the trade is not detrimental to the survival of American eel, and they would make an NDF or a non-detriment finding. To make a positive NDF, we often see that Fish and Wildlife Service reaches out to you, the state fish and wildlife agencies, to ask for your data, your information, and your opinion on whether that trade is not detrimental to the survival of a species. The other piece that's required in Appendix 2 is a legal acquisition finding, again stating that the species was legally acquired by the laws of the US, whether those are national or state agency laws. I mentioned bobcats and river otter before. The way that the US Fish and Wildlife Service deems that they are legally acquired is by the use of a tag. So each skin and each bobcat pelt that leaves the country has a tag on it that's put on by the states and trappers, and then it is deemed legally acquired. I know this, Tony and I have talked about the legal acquisition finding a bit, and that's just one example of how legal acquisition finding is determined. I'll mention that with ginseng, there are often, many states have online harvester reporting that's done. And that is often used for legal acquisition finding, that a system that documents the harvest through an online reporting system. A recent example that we're still working through, at the last conference of the parties, a number of turtle species were listed, and snapping turtles, one of them. And we've had some difficulties moving snapping turtles, and some of the asks for legal acquisition for that species were when and where the species was harvested, harvester licenses, signed statements from the suppliers as to where they got their supply, because those turtles are mixed together, if you will, prior to international export. So I think those are just a couple examples. We don't necessarily know exactly what would be required because it's not listed yet, required for American eel, but those are some of the things that have been required in the past. Go to the next slide. Appendix 3. For this appendix, I mentioned that this is a unilateral decision by a country, and Fish and Wildlife Service is considering and has reached out to the states asking their opinion on Appendix 3. I know Tony and others and Pat have been very involved in those conversations. The intent of an Appendix 3 listing is to get assistance from other countries on regulating harvest and to gather data about harvest levels typically. For this appendices, a non-detriment finding is not required, but a legal acquisition finding is required. So again, some proof of legal acquisition, which would likely include some sort of chain of custody process be developed if it isn't already developed within each state. I think I might just pause there for 1 second if you want, or do you want me to continue and just move into the resolution piece? Okay. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Caitlin and I wanted Deb to come today to give us some information on this because we have been speaking with Fish and Wildlife Service a little bit about concerns. We provided the board through, I think, an email in early summer, some concerns that we had about or had on Appendix 3. We recently had a conversation with Fish and Wildlife Service and that they let us know that they were also considering Appendix 2. That was not, I believe, in the original letter that was sent to AFWA asking for comments on Appendix 3. And so we're hoping that, you know, in addition to the letter we'd sent before, if there's any concerns or questions that states have about the listing or potential listing of an Appendix 3 or Appendix 2 for eel, that you share those concerns with us either today or in the future. Fish and Wildlife Service has said that they will be reaching out to each individual state to have a consultation with you all on these. We let them know that everybody has different fisheries, different regulations around their fisheries. We are not sure if any of these listings will be for all American eel, will it be just for yellow eel, will it be or just for elvers? Because all of those things potentially could be on the table based on information that we've had. So we're really looking for anything that you would like us and AFWA, because Deb has been instrumental in helping us get these concerns to Fish and Wildlife Service, but to let us know what your concerns are so we can make sure that they're raised and addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And I'll say one thing to add there is that for an Appendix 2 listing, that is a process that's got started because the Fish and Wildlife Service has a series of Federal Register notices that they publish before a conference of the parties asking for public input. And that happened in May. And there was a recommendation to list American eel in Appendix 2. So that is now on the table. And that is something that is going to be decided in the coming months. And I'll talk a little bit more about that calendar, but that decision and if a proposal would be submitted, that would be submitted in June of 2025. So that's kind of the timeline. And Appendix 3 is slightly different because it is a unilateral decision. The Fish and Wildlife Service can decide to list a species in Appendix 2 any time of the year, and it doesn't really have a timeline associated with it. But I'm happy to answer any questions now or finish up.
Yeah, that sounds like a good approach. We'll take some questions on this topic before we move on. I see John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Deborah. I'm just curious. I mean, it seems to me 20 years ago, they started a process of listing American eel under CITES. And I think at the time, the process just ended. We received a letter from the Fish and Wildlife Service just yesterday about the potential to list it under CITES. Where is the impetus coming from this time to list it?
Yeah, good question. So it's American eel has been discussed and recommended for listing in the last 3 or 4 years through CITES. And most of the time it comes from NGOs. I believe the recommendations this time that were for an Appendix 2 listing were from Wildlife Conservation Society, Center for Biological Diversity, and a few others. So that's where the Appendix 2 is coming from, sort of pressure from the outside. There are also conversations we've been having with the European Union because the European eel is listed, and so people continue to raise the lookalike issue and how we deal with that at certain life stages. So that's another piece of it. For Appendix 3, I can't speak for Fish and Wildlife Service as to their intention or why they decided to raise the possibility of an Appendix 3 right now. So we'd have to ask them exactly kind of where they stand. And I don't know, Tony, if they shared with you any of their interest in Appendix 3 or not, but that one I'd have to get them to answer more specifically.
Okay, next we have Pat Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deb, thank you for coming today and sharing this information. If you don't deal with CITES all the time and you're in and out of looking at the requirements, it becomes confusing. But can you just clarify for me the difference between Appendix 2 and Appendix 3, excuse me, as it pertains to inspection by U.S. Fish and Wildlife? Do they both require inspection for export?
Yeah, they do, and they would both require a permit. It would just be that the permit for Appendix 2 is a slightly more onerous permit because it requires a non-detriment finding and a legal acquisition, where for Appendix 3 for export, it would require a legal acquisition finding and also a permit as well.
As you know, we stated in our letter from back in June, the delay issue associated with this. Most exports are not with live animals, so I would assume. I'm sure there are some live animal exports that we're dealing with here, but the delay in the export is something that's really concerning. We've raised this issue with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and since my good friend Rick Jacobson's in the far corner of the room, who wants to stay as far away from this issue as he possibly can, knows I'm very concerned about the liability associated with the delayed shipments of eels based on an inspection. It's clear that something that's going to be held up for even 6 or 7 hours could cause huge mortality events with those shipments. So it's one thing it's an issue that I've already put on the table, and we're going to need to continue to make sure that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is aware of that. And this board should understand, we're not talking about just glass eels here. This could also impact yellow eel fishery as well for exports on yellow eels. So this is a bigger issue than just the Maine Elver fishery, and something we're going to need to make sure we stay very engaged in. But thank you, and Deb, thanks again for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And it's definitely a real concern because we know we have a lot of data on how long it does take to get permits.
And please tell your new president of AFWA that I'm expecting her to be very engaged on this issue.
Judy is on top of it. But yes, and I will say that I would doubt that an Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 listing would focus on Elvers versus, I don't think there would be a differentiation. I think it would be all exports of any life stage of an American eel.
Okay, next we have Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, once something becomes listed, whether it's Appendix 2 or Appendix 3, that's one thing. What's the process to delist something that is on the list?
Yeah. That is a tough one. So Appendix 2, it requires a vote at the conference of the parties. It requires a proposal for delisting or downlisting and a vote at the conference of the parties, either of consensus or 2/3 majority. I have to be honest, you don't get many, I can't off the top of my head think of any examples of delisting that weren't related to extinction of a species. And so it's very difficult to delist or downlist a species in an Appendix 2 or Appendix 1. Appendix 3, that's a unilateral decision by the United States to remove it. We have had challenges getting things off the list, and it's a little unclear exactly the process and whether they have the authority to do that. So it's another, it's a bit challenging, to be honest.
I think I saw a hand from Ross Self earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question's been addressed. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Robert LaFrance.
I guess my question is about what responsibilities do the states have in terms of being able to demonstrate that the fish would be legally taken? What records has to be provided? How the state goes about? How does the state go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we don't. I know Tony and others have asked for a bit more detail on what the Fish and Wildlife Service would require, and we don't know it for certain. But past examples include when and where the species was harvested, harvester licenses, chain of custody, signed statements from suppliers that they got, this shipment of eels from X, Y, and Z who are licensed harvesters who harvested within the season, et cetera, et cetera. So I wish I had a really solid answer for you, but definitely some sort of chain of custody process that we want some more information on. I know, Tony.
So this was one of our biggest concerns, Robin. We asked that direct question of Fish and Wildlife Service, and they, I don't think we will get a response on this. They said it'll be up to the individual applying for the permit to provide the appropriate documentation. And I suggested back that we get a list of documentations that individual could provide, because it doesn't seem fair for an individual to not know what they're supposed to provide and try to apply and get a permit in a timely fashion when they have no idea what they're supposed to be giving them. Eric, we also asked directly what would constitute a delisting and are waiting a response for that as well.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for letting me have a follow-up question. I'm just curious, is this discretionary on the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service, especially Appendix 3? I mean, is there something in the law that requires them to pursue this action, or did they just decide that there's enough information that they want to pursue this?
Yeah, it's discretionary. Each country can make a decision on what they'd like to list in Appendix 3. There's no requirement for them to do so. Appendix 2, another country like Canada, for example, they won't, but they could bring a proposal for listing American eel. So another range state could bring it. But
If I meant more in terms of, are they required to take action based on, you said there were petitions to list this. Do they have, like under the Endangered Species Act, I know they get to the point where they have to, do a 90-day finding of something. Is there any requirement under this?
no,
So this is
now I understand.
100% on them right now that they're deciding to do this.
So they do have a process. Once they hear from the public, they go through a due diligence process in investigating each species. I don't know, there were hundreds of species recommended. But it's not required by law. They have their own process they go through, which is what they're going through. The Appendix 3 is totally separate and of their own discretion.
Okay, are there any more questions on Appendix 2, Appendix 3 before we move? Okay, I see Jeff Kalen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought maybe Pat might ask this, but I know that there's a company in Maine that's growing out elvers into glass eels, and I understand somebody told me that she has in her tanks as many yellow eels as are harvested normally in the Atlantic. What would be the difference in the treatment of eels that were raised and in the channels of trade versus those that are wild caught? Is there a distinction, or is it just an eel as far as CITES would go?
I guess Tony shared that she doesn't export, but at the same time, in answer to your question, they would be slightly different, but you would have to prove where the stock came from. So it's not necessarily, so you could either take stock from the wild or you could be breeding, depending on the species. And if you were taking anything from the wild, that would have to be proven to be non-detrimental, or you would have to prove that you have a closed system and that you weren't taking species, you weren't taking the species from the wild. So it would be slightly different if they were exporting internationally, but if they're taking species from the wild, then it wouldn't be highly different. But
Yeah, no, that's okay. She may not be exporting now, but she may someday, who knows? So thank you.
Carrie Kennedy, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to show my ignorance and ask, so if something gets listed in Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 for the United States, does that hold other countries accountable to the same requirements in exporting of similar species?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for Appendix 2, it does. So if Canada, if it's listed in Appendix 2, Canada, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, others who are exporting American eel would have to have the same permits and certificates. The slight difference is for a, say, for a legal acquisition finding, it's really up to the country what they require in order to prove that. So you might not have the same amount of rigor, let's put it that way, or the same amount of information requested by different countries. But if it abided by that country's laws, then they would still get a permit. For Appendix 3, there would be no requirements for any other country to do anything other than require that when they import American eel, it has that CITES permit. But Appendix 3 is only for the US.
Okay, any final questions before we move on to remainder? I see Pat Kelleher.
Just if with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to ask the members of the board if any other states besides Delaware have received a letter from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mass has. Okay. Well, hope. Okay, great. Thank you. Mine must be in the mail, lost in the mail somewhere.
Yes.
Steve Train.
I wasn't going to ask, but after the last question, maybe it's my ignorance. So if you don't mind, so if there were one or two countries that are having trouble managing a fishery, they could say, well, we can't manage our fishery, so we just need to find a way to close this. We'll ask CITES to do something, and the countries that are managing the fishery will get punished. Is that what I understand could happen?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about it that way before, but certainly if the Dominican Republic, for example, although they have a pretty good handle on themselves, but if they decided that an Appendix 2 listing of eels would be helpful for them in managing their fishery, however they would want it, whether that's, you know, managing it to a closure or managing it to something else, they could put forward a proposal. They would have to speak with all the range countries and have a conversation. They couldn't just do it without having a conversation with the US and Canada and others. Yeah, I suppose that could be one way to look at it if a country tried to do that. I don't think that happens too often, but I guess it's not out of the realm of possibility.
That's a good question. I think we're all learning about this process certainly as we go through this. So we'll go ahead and move on at this point with the remainder of Deborah's presentation.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for all the questions. You're gonna move to the next slide. Thanks. So the final thing I wanted to talk about was another part of a conversation in CITES that is talking about developing a genus level resolution on eels. So this resolution is being developed through the policy arm of CITES, which is called the Standing Committee. And that Standing Committee created a working group at its last meeting. AFWA has a seat on that working group. Buddy Baker and Gordon Batchelor, who I mentioned earlier, are the representatives that sit on that working group. And they're the ones that we're going to be able to work through to provide recommendations, edits, etc., so that we can influence the text of this resolution. Unfortunately, I was really hopeful that we might have a draft to go on and kind of share a bit more information with you here, but we do not have a draft yet. That working group is probably solely going to work through email, but if there is a virtual meeting that comes up, we'll let you know if there's opportunity to participate. The working group will meet till sometime in December, where at that point they will need to submit a draft resolution to the Standing Committee for consideration at their February meeting from February 3rd to 8th. What that means is that at that meeting, the parties and the observers will consider the draft resolution. They may create an in-session working group to further refine it, but a resolution will come out of that meeting that would then be forwarded to the Conference of the Parties for their approval at the end of 2025. So we have a number of opportunities to influence the text of this resolution through the working group first off, and working with you guys at the actual Standing Committee in February. AFWA will be there. There'll likely be probably myself and Gordon Batchelor, but as always, Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission or an individual state is always able to attend these meetings as an observer, where you can take the floor if called on by the chair, and you can make interventions and participate in those working groups. So that's always an option. It doesn't just have to be us, but we will be there. And then, of course, once it gets to the Conference of the Parties, there's another opportunity within that meeting. It gets a little bit harder at that point to change text. So really the working group and the Standing Committee be our focus. So what is a resolution? So CITES has this broad generic text of that provides a basic framework of how the convention functions and what it does. But there are parts of it that are fairly broad in nature. And so every now and again, resolutions are developed to provide guidance, to provide a set of rules, to really kind of narrow down implementation. And resolutions are one way of doing this. They are intended to be fairly permanent. So a resolution is anticipated to last for a number of years, and it can be revised over time every 2 to 3 years at that Conference of the Parties. So since I don't have a draft to share with you, the text on the screen is the resolution around marine turtles. And I shared that because I feel like the way that the eel resolution is probably going to go is going to be fairly similar. As you're all familiar with, you have a set of whereas statements and then recommendations. Most of these recommendations will likely focus around improving collaboration, in sharing data, in enhancing monitoring, in convening workshops, in discussing cooperation around law enforcement. So how do the parties work together to improve, enhance the conservation of eels? And that's all eel species, whether you're listed in CITES or not. None of these things will be necessarily required, but it will be recommendations that the US will bring back and consider how we might implement those and how we might help implement the resolution. So it is important that we're comfortable with the text. I do think it is going to be fairly high level, and it's not going to be a heavy lift for all of you because you have the management and the reporting and things like that. It'll be interesting. We've been in a lot of conversations with Canada, who at the moment are not supportive of an Appendix 2 listing of eels. They are, as many of you know, going to open their fisheries again soon, and they'll have, from what I can understand in our conversations, some fairly strict measures around requirements and reporting, etc. So for them, an Appendix 2 listing really wouldn't be something highly useful. So I think that is good for us, depending on where all of you land on what your recommendation would be around appendix listings for eel. You go to the next slide. So the final thing I wanted to mention is just kind of our timeline here for all of this. This slide sadly is now out of date as of this morning because we finally found out when the Conference of the Parties is going to be. So that makes the dates on here much more solid. So if we're working backwards, November 24th to December 5th of 2025 will be the Conference of the Parties, where the parties would vote on a listing proposal if one is brought forward for Appendix 2. Not for Appendix 3. So that's November, December 2025. Where we are, if you step back from that, the document submission deadline, so if a proposal were to be put forward for listing, it would need to be submitted by June 27th of 2025. So that's kind of where we are with the Appendix 2 listing. In the most current state, what we want to do is we want to influence that text of the resolution before December, and hopefully we'll have a draft soon to share with you. We also anticipate that the next Federal Register notice that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will put out will come out in November or December. And what that will be a table that lists all those hundreds of species that the public recommended for listing, including American eel. And it will put each species in a category that would be likely, unlikely, or undecided on whether they were bringing a listing proposal forward. If history is any indication, and especially in an election year, many of the species will be in the undecided category, so it won't be super helpful for us to know exactly where they are. But it does provide an opportunity, a 60-day comment period. So we should talk at that point about what information do we want to share publicly on the conservation and management of eels. You know, does this board, does the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission want us to come forward with a position at that time to either support or not support, or do we say nothing? So those are the kind of things we're going to want to talk about, and we'll have some time to do that once we have that Federal Register notice at that time. And then we have the February meeting of the Standing Committee that'll finalize that eel resolution, and that's February 3rd to the 8th. That June, July 2025 Federal Register notice will be kind of another step in the Fish and Wildlife Service process. And that will also be announcement of a public meeting. But at that point, the ship will have sailed on resolutions and proposals. So that'll be another opportunity to weigh in, but much later than we want to. So that's why we're working already in those conversations. So you can go to the last slide, and Tony, that's it for me, more than enough. My contact and Buddy and Gordon's as well, should anyone want to reach out to us.
So I think Deb just provided one piece of information that'll be essential for staff to have direction from the board. But so Fish and Wildlife Service will have that Federal Register notice in November or December. And if the commission wants to send a letter of comment during that 60-day period, it may or may not fall within a board timeframe, depending on the timing of it. If it comes in November, that would likely, 60 days would likely not fall in the board meeting timeframe. And even if it does, it's right at the end of that 60-day timeframe. So we would need to have a better understanding, probably through email discussion with the board, on whether or not we want to provide any comments on support, not support of any potential listing. So just to keep that in the back of your mind, if we need to put together a call, we can also do that during that time frame.
Thanks for that, Tony. I think, given the importance of this issue and the timeline it's presented to us, certainly we need to be thinking about how we might respond to this in the near term, and thank Deborah for a very informative presentation and good, robust discussion around the table. Do we have any additional questions, discussion regarding the CITES resolutions and timelines that were described at the end of the presentation, or if there was anything that we missed early on regarding the appendices listings? Dan McKernan.
Pat asked who received the letters, and I received mine at 8:30 this morning, and there was 2 attachments. One was the letter to me, and the second is an announcement of a webinar on November 6th from 11 to 12 p.m. And it appears to be an invitation for states to participate in this webinar. So just letting you know, I haven't seen this in the description of the process, but I'm just sharing that.
Pat Keller.
Yeah, our first order of business may be a letter to them to say, giving more advance notice to state that it has not been received by myself or any of my staff. I did on November 6th webinar for the states to participate in. There's not a lot of short notice, which is not great from my standpoint. Deb, you mentioned the resolution and the meeting on the resolution in February. Where is that? And you said others can participate in that?
Yeah, anyone is always welcome to participate as an observer, and we can help you through that process. It is in Geneva, Switzerland, February 3rd to 8th.
Yeah. This, I'm always up for a road trip.
Yeah, it's a good road trip.
But this is a $20 million fishery for the state of Maine. So obviously others may be interested, but I certainly would be interested in talking about that. So.
Great.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions that I see at the end of the table, or did I imagine, Rick, did you raise your hand?
I think I've retreated to the shadows.
Okay. Understood. So any other questions, discussions on this subject? Rick's back.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Mr. Chairman, and number one, Deb, thank you very much. I miss working with you and the CITES Technical Committee. It was a lot of fun when we did it together. But I do have a question for the board. I do have an avenue to reach out to the International Affairs Program also. That might be a little different than AFWA and the Commission. And so if there is a problem with Commission members not receiving letters from International Affairs, I would be happy to reach back out to them. I know that we did communicate with the International Affairs Office a little over a month ago. Their original plan had been to reach out to members of the American Eel Technical Committee. We advised that that would be more appropriate for those letters to be sent to the members of the management board themselves. It sounds like some of that has happened already, but if it's not consistent across the board, I'd be happy to communicate something along those lines if it helps the board's work.
Thanks for that, Rick. I don't want to presume for the board, but from my perspective, I think that would be very helpful because it seems like a number of states and jurisdictions have not received letters. If you could do that, unless there's opposition from the board, I don't see any. So Rick, please help facilitate that for us. So is there any other questions or discussion on the CITES topic on our agenda for today? Eric Reed.
Yeah, sorry, I got lost in my calendar, my own head in the calendar about possibly drafting a letter or having a position statement by this group in time for whatever the deadline might be. So what's the timeline for that? I mean, is that something we should start thinking about like today?
That's in response to whatever is in the FR notice. I mean, I think Deb has alluded to oftentimes that most species are listed as undecided. And so if this board has a position regardless of how it is, then we can send a letter doing that. If there's a position that this board has, if it's, you're not opposed to listing, but you have concerns about X, Y, Z or ZZ things about the process, whatever it is that the board wants to address, we can do so. But it would be technically in response to this decision on is going to list for Appendix 2, list for Appendix 3. I don't know if Appendix 1 would even, they told us Appendix 1 wasn't being considered, so hopefully that doesn't show up.
I would just add, I think you have all the information. You have the information you need right now to a degree. I didn't know they were having a webinar, so you may get more information there. I'm not sure. But I think this ability to respond to the Federal Register notice that comes out either in November or December will really be around Appendix 2. I think you have most of the information you're probably going to have to make a decision on whether you want to send a letter, whatever it says, asking for more clarification, stating a position or not. So I think it's something you can start thinking about. And anytime we get more information, we'll be sharing it as quickly as we can if something changes. But at this point, I think you have a lot of the information you're going to have.
So Eric, does that answer your question or alleviate any concerns there? I mean, it sounds like we have the information in front of us that we're going to get before the deadline in order to make any decision as to whether or not a letter is warranted.
That's quite frankly, Mr. Chair, my concerns are not going to be alleviated, period. It's a one-way street. When you get listed, it's a one-way street. I am concerned about my constituents on this board, and I just want to make sure that our comment is prepared and ready to go when it's time. That's all.
Appreciate that, Eric. So any other comments from the board on a path forward with a letter? I mean, it sounds like we could start to think about that now, perhaps draft something at this point and have that ready to go.
We can do that if the sentiment is the same for the rest of the board as Eric, then, that's very easy for us to do.
Yeah, I'm sensing a similar notion from around the table, but I don't want to pursue anything. So is there opposition to advancing a letter at this point? So I don't see any. So I think, does that provide enough direction to staff to take this?
We can draft a letter to oppose, and we can continue with some of the questions that were in our other letter, and that's where our concerns are. And we have time between now and then to have iterations go back and forth with members of the board.
Pat Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Share the sentiments of my friend across the table, Mr. Reed, when it comes to any kind of listing. I think the one thing that we need to keep our eye on, though, is the resolution that Deb spelled out. That resolution is a much less threatening piece, but actually puts much needed information on the table for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other parties about how our fisheries are conducted. Maine has already submitted a letter to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as has AFWR and the Commission, with a lot of the basis of the information that is needed. So I think, as Tony and Deb have said, we've got what we need in hand to craft, I think, a strongly worded letter. But I don't want to lose sight of the resolution and a trip to Switzerland.
I'll put my skis in a truck and I'll be ready to go with you, so no problem.
Deborah has a response for that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Pat, and I think that is true. I mean, the interesting thing about all this is how everything plays off one another, and it's kind of a bit of a game of chess. So The Appendix 2 listing is the most restrictive and right? It's the hardest to get removed. It is the most restrictive. It has the most requirements. Then you move back to Appendix 3, a little less, but still concerns about timing of permits and things like that. And then you move back to a resolution. And I think in some respects, I would like to think of putting time into developing a robust resolution that CITES parties within that working group are very excited about, that would then say, okay, well, we shouldn't list a species before we enact the actions decided in this resolution. And that resolution would not even be approved till December of next year. So I think you're right, and I don't think we should lose sight of the resolution, and we'll really want your input on that so that we can have something that is really, you know, of a good quality, that maybe we can use that as our, you know, chess piece of saying, well, let's not move forward with these other pieces.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, does the U.S. State Department participate in this process? I'm on the Atlantic salmon, on a federal, or excuse me, an international Atlantic salmon body as a non-federal commissioner, and the U.S. State Department participates in that process. Do they participate in this process?
They do.
They do.
Yeah, yeah. Fish and Wildlife Service is the lead, but state is there. Forest Service, USDA,
yeah.
NOAA.
Okay. All right.
All the federal agencies participate.
That's good to know. Thank you. The U.S. State Department is certainly, when it comes to salmon issues, really tones down some of the government interactions with other countries from a salmon perspective. So I was just curious, and it may be a avenue here as well for us politically. So thank you.
So Caitlin, Tony, do you have enough information, feedback from the board to initiate a draft letter? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to the next item number 5 on the agenda, which is to consider approval of the fisheries management plan review and state compliance for the 2023 fishing year. So Caitlin is going to lead us into questions and discussions with the presentation. Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in this presentation, I'll go over the status of the FMP, the status of the stock, status of the fishery, and the PRT review of state compliance with the FMP provisions, and then wrap up with PRT recommendations. So to start, these are the FMP and addenda provisions that apply to all states with eel fisheries. All states are required to implement a young of year survey and maintain regulations as strict or stricter than what was in place before the FMP was implemented. And the FMP addenda also require trip level CPUE data reporting, allow for the development of sustainable fishery management plans in order to deviate from the FMP requirements, and provide the aquaculture allowance of 200 pounds of glass eel per state with board approval. And for any alternative fishery management plan, the state must scientifically demonstrate that it will not increase overall fishing mortality. Specific to the glass eel fisheries, there is a maximum tolerance of 25 pigmented eel per pound of glass eel harvest. And the FMP establishes Maine's glass eel quota, which has been 9,688 pounds since 2015. The glass eel fishery also requires daily trip level reporting, and Maine does this through their electronic monitoring program, which allows them to track landings from harvesters to dealers and to export. And they're also required to conduct a life cycle survey that covers all life stages. Addendum 6 was approved this past May, and it maintained that quota for Maine's glass eel fishery. There have been no other changes to the FMP requirements for glass eel. For yellow eel, the FMP requires a minimum size of 9 inches and a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch minimum mesh size on eel pots or traps. Addendum 3 required the recreational bag limit of 25 eel per day with an allowance of 50 fish per day for hire captains and crew. And Addendum 4 established the coastwide commercial harvest cap for yellow eel, which was updated by Addendum 5, and also the 10% overage trigger for management. And I just want to note here that the commercial harvest cap will decrease to 518,821 pounds starting in 2025 under Addendum 7. For silver eel, the FMP requires a closure from September 1st through December, during which no eel take is allowed except for from baited traps, pots, and spears. The Delaware River was granted an exemption from this requirement, and it is currently now restricted to only 9 permits. So Maine is the only state with an aquaculture plan, and the first year of aquaculture fishing in Maine was 2019. And in 2023, 200 pounds were harvested for aquaculture. For 2024, Maine has submitted their proposal that was approved for another 200 pounds of glass eel, and Maine continues to allocate that to American unagi. The status of the stock for eel is based on the benchmark stock assessment, which was peer reviewed in 2022 and accepted for management in 2023. And the assessment concluded that the stock remains depleted or at or near historically low levels due to a range of factors. The assessment also noted that the yellow eel abundance has continued to decline since the last assessment, and the stock assessment does not provide an overfishing or overfished status for eel. The board responded to the assessment results through Addendum 7 approved in May, which lowers that coast-wide cap for yellow eel. And this is, as a reminder, the abundance index trend from the benchmark assessment with the upper and lower 95% confidence intervals. And these are the annual landings estimates dating back to 1950. The coast-wide cap is shown on the graph here by the dashed red line starting after 2013 when it was established. In 2023, the commercial landings are in the FMP review are provided by the state compliance reports, so they're still considered preliminary. But the 2023 coast-wide yellow eel landings were just shy of 296,000 pounds, which is a 10% decrease from 2022 and represents 32% of the coast-wide harvest cap. Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey made up 80% of the total coast-wide harvest in 2023. And for glass eel, Maine harvested 9,510 pounds in 2023. South Carolina also has glass eel harvest, but the data is confidential. So moving on to the PRT, or Plan Review Team's review of the state compliance reports. The PRT reviewed all of the compliance reports and found no issues with state implementation of the glass eel requirements. And with regard to yellow eel provisions, the PRT noted one issue, which is that New York's regulations for the minimum mesh size are not consistent with the requirements of the FMP. This was raised last year, and New York is currently in the process of correcting their regulations to be consistent with the FMP. For silver eel, the PRT noted two small issues, which is that Delaware and Florida have not implemented regulations preventing harvest of eels from pound nets from September 1st through December 31st. Delaware has no reported pound net landings for over 50 years and will plan to address this the next time changes are made to their eel regulations. And Florida is also unaware of any active pound net fishery in the past decade or more. To qualify for de minimis status for eel, a state's average landings for the 2 preceding years must be under 1% for a particular life stage. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, Georgia, and Florida all requested de minimis status for yellow eel. And all of the states except for Florida qualify, but Florida's average landings for 2022 and 2023 are just slightly greater than 1% of the coast-wide landings at 1.1%. And in addition to considering the state compliance notes that are in Section 7 of the FMP review, the PRT also recommends that de minimis status be granted to Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, DC, and Georgia for their yellow eel fisheries. The PRT maintains the recommendation that the board reevaluate the requirement for states to provide estimates of the percent of harvest that goes towards food versus towards bait. There's a high level of uncertainty and subjectivity inherent in that data, and the PRT noted that this information does not currently impact regulations and it's unclear of what the benefit for management is. The PRT also requests again that the board consider tasking the Committee on Economic and Social Sciences, or the CES, to conduct an analysis of market demand for all of eel life stages, specific to food versus bait markets, and looking into international market demand. And then lastly, the PRT recommends the Commission and U.S. Fish and Wildlife continue to work together to annually look at the domestic landings data and export data for eel across all life stages. And I can take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin, for the presentation. Any questions regarding the presentation? I see Sheree Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have specific questions. I just would like to have a slight change on the report on page 8, under the status of research and monitoring. On the second paragraph, you have that Connecticut monitors the Lamprey River. And if you can move the Lamprey River to New Hampshire, I think we'd both be happier.
Thank you, Sheree.
And if you'd like to have a motion brought forward, then I could do that if they bring it up in the future.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted the PRT's recommendation to ask the CES to take a look at the markets and all that. Seems like a very good idea to me. Does the board have to request that, or is that something that just based on this PRT review will happen?
I think it would be helpful for the board to agree to that tasking.
All right. Does it need a motion, or is it just kind of a recommendation from the board? I would like to make that recommendation. If the rest of the board is okay with it, then I guess we can proceed that way.
Yes, I think just a recommendation would be fine.
And this is pertaining to item number 4, John, correct?
Right. It was the recommendation to have the Committee on the Economics and Social Sciences take a look at it.
So this has been recommended to the board before. So John makes a recommendation that we move forward with that. Is there any opposition from the board to move forward with that recommendation? All right, I don't see any. So you have what you need, Caitlin? Any additional questions for Caitlin? Pat Keller?
So are we going to move forward? Is the idea we're going to move forward with all the recommendations from the PRT? I know the comparing exports with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is, I think, critically important. Last year, if you all remember, there was a paper from a researcher from Japan who we actually just recently met with, who lumped in all North American exports. And it was very confusing because it looked like, if you were reading it quickly, that the U.S. was exporting hundreds of thousands of pounds of Elvers when it was being captured, I think, with what was going on, probably mostly in Canada. So I think having that comparison done is going to be really important.
I think we can do that, and I believe the sentiment from the board probably matches yours.
Okay, any additional questions, comments on the presentation, the plan review team, recommendations? All right, anything online? Oh. Yes, Carrie Kennedy.
Ingrid.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ingrid.
No worries. So first off, thank you, Mr. Chair, and also thank you, Caitlin, and the American Eel PRT for preparing the 2023 FMP review. I had a question whether or not on the first page under management summary, whether or not addendum 6 and 7 should be included on that, or if that's something that goes in later FMPs when those addendum relate specifically. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So this is the FMP review for the 2023 fishing year. So I didn't include it in the list because it's not relevant to management for that year, but it will be in future reports.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So is anybody prepared to make a motion with respect to the FMP review and the state compliance? Sheree Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to approve the American Eel FMP review for the 2023 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, DC, and Georgia.
We have a second. Steve Train. Okay, Sheree, as the maker of the motion, do you have any comments on that?
No, just moving forward with the PDT's recommendations.
Okay, is there any discussion on the motion? Is there any need to caucus on the motion? Seeing none, I'm going to try and do this the easy way. Is there any opposition to the motion? Okay, seeing none, the motion passes by consent. Okay, that takes us to other business. Is there any other business to come before the American Eel Management Board today? Okay, seeing none. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Pat Keller, Sheree seconds. Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.